Hello, this is a critique of a video game. Within this video report, I will discuss my game of choice and then talk about the formal and dramatic events in the game. For a game to be a success, it must follow a sort of system. Even though there is no defined set of rules, there is a suggested guide. Without this guide, a game becomes unrecognizable. The game I've chosen is Batman Arkham Knight. Batman Arkham Knight is an action-adventure game developed by Rocksteady Studios and published by Warner Bros. The Arkham series' main character is Batman. It is a third-person perspective game with the primary focus on Batman's melee combat, stealth abilities, detective skills, and gadgets. Arkham Knight is set within Gotham City. The story is that Batman is faced with several supervillains. He must overcome Scarecrow's plot to threaten Gotham City, conquer the Riddler's challenges. The game introduces the villain, Arkham Knight, a character specifically designed for the game. Remember that guide I mentioned for a good game? Well, the first part of that guide are the 8 formal elements. They are the elements needed to make a game different from all other forms of media. They make the structure of the game. Without these elements, it would be hard to tell a game from a movie. As these elements affected the player's interaction with the game, the formal elements are as listed: players, objectives, rules, procedures, resources, conflict, boundaries, and outcome. Now that I know you have an idea of the formal rules, let's have a look at them in the game. Formal element 1. Player. How do players interact? Well, since the game is based around Batman, the famous lone superhero, the game is a single player. There is no co-op play in the game. I don't actually see how it would work with the flow of the game. Everything Batman does seem that little bit hard when he has to face it alone. There is an online ranked play in the form of a variety of challenge maps such as race and combat modes. They allow players to challenge other players from across the world to beat their score. This adds a new level of interaction to a single-player game. Formal element 2. Objectives. Objectives are what the player is trying to achieve. Within this element, there are subcategories for games to fall into, and Batman glides into a few of them. The main one is capture, and then exploration. Capture because it was decided that it was the closest fitment for following the narrative, and exploration because of the size of the game and attention to detail within the story and gameplay. This adds to replayability. There are other objectives within the side missions. There is race, with all the Batmobile missions. A high percentage of the side missions are aimed towards alignment and solution, as Batman's villain Riddler has challenges within the game. Formal element 3. Rules. Rules define the game objects and define allowable actions by the player. The rules of Arkham Knight are the same as most games in this style. The more basic rules are when the player is hit by an enemy a certain amount of times, they have to respawn, and when the player deals enough damage, they defeat an enemy. The rules are also like the instructions of the game. These are shown to the player within the story. Batman gets new armor early on in the game, and to test it out, he must complete AR challenges. These challenges show the player how to fight. Use gadgets. The player is given a set of minor tasks to do with instructions and controls on screen, as well as there being a control guide in the pause menu. Formal element 4. Procedures. Procedures are actions taken by the player in the game. These procedures are things as basic as movement controls. The player moves the analog stick left, and the player then walks leftwards. There are more complex procedures in Arkham Knight, like the Wayne Tech upgrade system. When the player upgrades Batman's armor, this is an action that affects how much damage a player can take before Batman is defeated. Another example of procedures in Arkham Knight is the way in which side missions are unlocked. Some are not made available until certain main story missions are completed. Formal element 5. Resources. Resources are elements or objects within the game that hold value only within the world of the game. In most games, if not all digital games, there are resources. These could be things like money, units, lives, time, or even inventory. These are materials or objects that can be useful to the play in completing the objective. Resources are also made scarce within the game to add to their importance. The best example of this in Arkham Knight is the Wayne Tech upgrade points. These points are given to the player for completing minor challenges. These points work as currency, as they are used to purchase upgrades for things like armor, health, gadgets. Batman also has a health bar, but as this regenerates over time, reducing its scarcity, I'm not sure if it even counts as a resource. Another resource in Arkham Knight is the inventory and gadgets. The player does not start out with all of Batman's gadgets and must collect them. Some of these gadgets have limited use, adding again to their scarcity. Formal Element 6. Conflict. Conflict deters the player from completing goals within the game. There are many examples of conflict within Arkham Knight, the main one being the forms of enemy, ranging in different difficulty. As the game goes on, the difficulty settings of the enemies increase. This is used to keep the player interested in the game. If it was too hard from the start, the player would not enjoy themselves, and they'd probably stop playing. The same goes for a game that is too easy from start to finish. Other forms of conflict within the game are the objectives, such as sentry guns, puzzles, blocked paths, time restrictions, and these are usually conflicts that can be overcome by thinking about the problems and with patience, while the enemy conflict is overcome by either button smashing or skill. The last type of conflict in Arkham Knight is dilemmas. This kind of conflict is used throughout the game, but the best non-spoiler example is when Batman's student Azrael must decide whether or not to betray Batman. The player must choose what decision to make. This affects the outcome. Formal Element 7. Boundaries. Where does the game end and reality begin? Boundaries are the confines of the map. Arkham Knight is a free-roaming game right from the start. This means the player can explore all the huge map, which is nearly 5 times the size of the previous game. When the player tries to glide out of the boundaries, they are forced back towards the center. There is no extra features of this game that take place in the real world. It is confined to the digital realm, with the obvious exception of the controller that vibrates when Batman takes damage or crashes. Formal Element 8. Outcome. How did the game end? There are a few different outcomes for Arkham Knight. There is conclusion to the main story mission when Batman takes down Scarecrow and learns the identity of the Arkham Knight. This is achieved by completing objectives and dealing with conflict in the main story. This is a satisfying ending to the game and ties up all the questions the player may have about the main story. There is another ending called the Nightfall Protocol. This is there for the players that want to come back to the game in hopes of seeing an alternative ending and learning more about the Arkham series' future. This ending is unlocked by completing 11 of the 14 most wanted side missions. There is also a percentage bar that the player could aim to fill to 100%. For some, that is the real end of the game. Conclusion to the formal elements in Arkham Knight. No element is basic or simple, most have subcategories, and after looking at the formal elements in Arkham Knight, I believe it is the best approach to not aim for all of these elements completely. For example, objectives. The main 2 types of objectives within Arkham Knight are capture and exploration, and other objectives are added to side missions which are optional to do. I feel like if they didn't do it this way, and they have several main objectives that change every second mission, the player would get confused and be unsure of what kind of game they are playing. I also like the way in which the controls are shown to the player. It is very useful in keeping the player's attention within the game, as the controls were shown in mini challenges rather than having the player stop and pause every 2 minutes to see what button does what. Another good formal element I noticed was in its conflict. The game has 3 different types: obstacles, enemies, and dilemmas. each one affecting the player in different ways, using intellect to overcome the obstacles, player skill to defeat enemies, and taking the player's emotions in dilemmas. Do they want to be good or bad? These may seem like too many conflicts within a game, but the way in which each of them is spread throughout the game, it works. You may have noticed it is all good feedback towards Arkham Knight. Well, yes, I feel like the game makes great use of the formal elements. My issues towards the game is more to do with the dramatic elements, which I shall discuss next. Now, on to the next part of that guide, the dramatic elements. Formal elements work together to create the experience we recognize as a game. Dramatic elements engage the player emotionally within the game experience and invest them in the game world. There are 7 dramatic elements. They are challenge, play, premise, story, world building, dramatic arc. Dramatic element 1. Challenge. Challenge engages a player in the game. Players enjoy being challenged and the feeling of overcoming that challenge. The challenge must grow in difficulty as the game goes on so as not to bore the player. This is done in Arkham Knight. As the game goes on, new enemies appear like bigger, badder gunners, whose takedowns are more challenging than enemies with swords or guns. Dramatic element 2. Play. Play can be thought of as a player's freedom to act within the constraints of the rules and procedures of the game. Within this element, there are different classes of players that play games for different reasons. Arkham Knight caters to a few of different types of players, the main ones being the explorer, the attention to detail, and hidden Easter eggs throughout the game. The achiever. There is a great sense of achievement when a player overcomes a Riddler challenge in dramatic element 3. Premise. Premise establishes the action of the game within a setting or metaphor. Without premise, a game would be too abstract for players to get emotionally invested. The premise for Arkham Knight is that you are Batman, and you must protect Gotham. Dramatic element 4. Characters. Characters are the agents through whose actions a drama is told. With the character being Batman, there is something for all players to enjoy. He is the most relatable DC comic hero, as he has no superpowers. He always tries to do the right thing. He has seen some tragic stuff, so players can feel for him emotionally. Dramatic element 5. Story. The story of Arkham Knight is one that has not fully seen in comics before. They did take major elements from the comics. I believe this is the downfall of Arkham Knight. There was a mystery built around the identity of Arkham Knight's character, but as soon as the character spoke, most fans of the comics or animated movies knew who it was. Another use of the story was the cutscenes. They were dramatic and long. They did help with the story, but took the player out of the gameplay. Dramatic element 6. World building. World building is the deep and intricate design of a fictional world. They build Gotham City in Arkham Knight. This should appeal to all players that are fans of the comics and previous games. There are many buildings from comic books, such as Ace Chemicals, Wayne Enterprises. There is also lots of Easter eggs throughout the city. Dramatic element 7. The dramatic arc. The dramatic element in Arkham Knight begins right from the start when the opening line is, "This is how Batman died." And through the game, things go against Batman and it seems there might be no chance for him. Towards the end of the main story, major